You can find things to like in every single country, but that doesn't mean it scales up well when you're importing millions of people. And we've seen that in Canada. A lot of American conservatives are looking at Canada or Australia and seeing some of the problems there as a sort of a mirror image of things that are going on in the U.S., but more extreme. And you don't really want to imitate the immigration systems of Canada or Australia, even though those have been more selective.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. I'm here with Ian Burke Perry. We lived together in the honors dorm at Baylor University, and haven't seen you in quite a while, but Ian is a lawyer and has had some specialty around immigration law. So welcome, Ian.
Yeah. So my practice has been focused on a variety of other things. I did have the opportunity recently to encounter another country's immigration system. I've lived in a few different countries. This particular topic was one that was more just one I was interested in, and I recently had an article published with American Reformer. I did a bit of a deep dive in it because people were saying things which weren't really, I didn't think were really right, or at least they weren't. People seem not to be aware that at least a different opinion was defensible. So my academic specialty, I've gotten to do a couple paid projects with it, is actually space law. So my legal claim to fame is I'm the world champion of an academic competition related to space and like treaty interpretation, that sort of thing. So there's some overlap with immigration in terms of being aware of what the implications of what U.S. laws are going to be. But this article was really motivated by it being timely and it being something I was interested in just personally as a citizen of a border state. This has always been immigration is, as long as I've been around, immigration's been a big deal in Texas. And so when I heard people discussing birthright citizenship, that was something I had a bit of background familiarity with. And I kind of knew what was there because of it being something which was relevant to my home state. And so I had researched a little bit before. So I did a deep dive. And then I had already had another article published with American Reformer, and they were interested in the topic. So I got the article published with them. And the main point of the article is there's not actually a Supreme Court case which says that illegal immigrants automatically have birthright citizenship. That's just not actually something that's been ruled on. The Supreme Court case which is most relevant to immigration is the Wong Kim Ark case. And that was dealing with a time before we had visas, which that was another big part of my article. So we had some sort of visas during the American Civil War, because obviously there were concerns about people moving around here, which were loyal to one side or the other. So it was a concern then. And then there were wartime visas during World War I, which got continued. And so the current visa system didn't exist until World War I, and it just kept going. There were several different things that kind of started around World War I that were continued past the war. And so there were some peacetime acts which set up something more like the modern immigration system. So the big case is way back in 1898. That's the Wong Kim Ark case. And that case dealt with somebody his parents were in the U.S. and he was from China, or his parents were from China. He was born in the U.S. And then he went back to his parents' home country, China. And then while he was away, laws prohibiting Chinese people moving to the U.S. were passed. And then so there's a Supreme Court case about that, and the Supreme Court ruled that he was a U.S. citizen by virtue of his birth. And of course, that was contentious because typically at the time, American citizenship was closely, not exclusively. I mean, there were some. It varied by state, but American citizenship was tied to being white. That wasn't something which was universal. You know, you went to one state that might have a different policy about freed slaves than another state. But the 14th Amendment had made all people who had been slaves were made citizens by the 14th Amendment. And so there's a question of how does that affect other groups of people that were not slaves? And so the Wong Kim Ark case said it's not limited to slaves. It also it could apply to children of immigrants as well. And so some people have gotten the idea that means you couldn't have any restriction of any category of people in the United States with regard to birthright citizenship. Now, I'm concerned about this practically because you create an incentive for somebody to just cross the border, have a child, and then maybe not have a lot of connection with the U.S. after that. And this has been true both in terms of legal immigration and illegal immigration. And so It means that anyone we let in the United States on a visa automatically, even if it's a temporary visa, it's not intended to establish permanent immigration. Anyone we let in can potentially make new American citizens just by being here. And so I don't think that was really the intent of the 14th Amendment. So in the article, I argue that there are statements that people made when the 14th Amendment was being discussed in the Senate, which either side could use. So I don't think it's just a slam dunk for one side or the other. You see senators who are I think the senators who are opposed to the 14th Amendment maybe in some cases had the broader idea of what it might mean, but that's not, you could probably find people on both sides that had a broader or narrower idea of what it meant. There's one senator, I think it was a Democrat from Delaware or Maryland, who said, this just means that we're giving citizenship to Black people who used to be slaves. But there's other statements in there which are broader. So some people definitely knew the 14th Amendment might have broader implications with regard to U.S. citizenship. And so my argument is we don't actually have to deny that to have some common sense restrictions, or okay, that's kind of maybe politicians' rhetoric, but there were restrictions at the time which were recognized and which are still in effect. So if you are the child of somebody who's working at an embassy, you're not an American citizen. If your parents are working for a foreign embassy or on an embassy staff or consular staff visa and you're born here, you're not a citizen, not under the U.S. law, even though you're in the country legally. And it was also the case that Native Americans were not made citizens by the 14th Amendment. It depended on the tribe, it depended on the exact circumstances, but it was not the case that all Native Americans had a right of birthright citizenship for their kids until there was a law passed in 1924. So they were, in some cases, depending on the tribes, some of those tribes had been in what is now the United States from time immemorial, but it required a congressional act to make them citizens. So it seems more consistent with those limitations that if somebody is here illegally, Congress at least has the option of saying, no, that doesn't make you a citizen. Because the 14th Amendment, it says you have to be subject to the jurisdiction thereof for there to be a right of birthright citizenship. And so I think it was kind of ambiguous at the time what that meant. The senators see people going back and forth about different things that might mean. And there's Supreme Court cases which take that more broadly or more narrowly. The Wong Kim Ark case, if we took all of the reasoning, I think it would be very expansive. But if you're practicing before a court, there's an idea of dicta. Not everything the court says is in a decision is considered binding on subsequent courts, right? So if the court makes an offhand comment about something, that may be interesting, that may be something you can use to support your case, but it's not, if the Supreme Court judge makes an offhand comment about something, lower courts may choose to follow that, but that's not binding in the same way the decision is. So yeah.
So Ian, what I'm hearing, again, I'm not a lawyer, I have no legal expertise, but the type of thing I'm hearing is if we end birthright citizenship, that puts us on the road to authoritarianism and fascism. And you're saying the actual, the legal side of this is actually a lot more ambiguous. There's a lot more nuance to it. And like a good lawyer, you're fleshing out that nuance. Is that right?
Right. I mean, I'm making a case. I'm arguing that there's a case that you could argue before the Supreme Court. It's not. The 14th Amendment was it. If you're an originalist, I think if I'm interpreting the Constitution, I want it to try and interpret it in line with the original public meaning. The 14th Amendment is a bit tricky because this is not as relevant to the issue we're discussing right now, but there's parts of it where the people drafting the 14th Amendment maybe didn't have the best understanding of the most accurate understanding of what the Constitution meant before then. So figuring out how it modified other articles in the Constitution, like say the Bill of Rights originally did not apply to the states. There's language in the 14th Amendment which looks like it applies it to the states, but some of the people involved with promulgating or drafting the 14th Amendment, the last time I dug into this has been a while, it looked like some of the people involved in that process, some of the senators, didn't have an accurate understanding of what the original drafters of the Constitution meant to do. And so then trying to interpret what the reasonable public meaning, the original public meaning of the 14th Amendment was, and synthesizing that with what the original Constitution meant, it becomes a little bit more tricky just because some of the people involved were maybe not the best judges of what their words were going to do because they didn't know what the starting situation was. And it was done, like when I was reading the debate over the 14th Amendment, this particular clause was one where, there wasn't a uniformity of opinion even among the Republicans. The Democrats tended to be, I think, pretty consistently suspicious of it at the time. But even among the Republicans, I don't know if there was uniformity. And there was about the whole amendment, there was a constant refrain on the part of I think it was mostly on the part of the Democrats, that this is being done in a caucus. So in other words, the Republicans are getting together back in the 1860s. Tensions are pretty high. President Lincoln was assassinated. And so under those circumstances, the Republicans were trying to get something passed. And maybe not all the Republicans were on board with all of the language there. So trying to tease out how we're faithful to the fact that, this is the law of the land, and trying to not just make stuff up, but reconciling that with the fact that the people involved in drafting the 14th Amendment were maybe they didn't always have a consistent idea among themselves of what it was going to do. So looking at the fact that it was understood that it didn't make consular staff, the children of consular staff citizens, it didn't make Native American citizens, even though both those groups are in the country legally, I think it's a very fair, reasonable interpretation to say it doesn't apply to illegal immigrants. Now, I'm not asking that we get rid of it completely. I think we should say, if you're here on an immigrant visa, if you have a green card, it applies to you. And I would say if you don't have an immigrant visa, I think there's reasons to at least pass a law that says it doesn't apply to non-immigrant visas, even though the chances that it'll be upheld, I think it's uncertain whether the courts would uphold that or not. So I think there's a big problem where you have people from countries coming in expressly for the purpose of having children in the United States. And that's legal. And it creates I would like us to be able to let more people in if we want to, without that automatically creating, like if we want to have temporary workers, I would like to have that debate separately from an immigration debate, right? So if we want to say, okay, we're going to have seasonal workers come in just during the, peak demand or something, I'm kind of skeptical of all of that right now, just because we've had such high immigration. But if we want to have that debate, I would like to separate that from the citizenship debate. And right now we really can't, because there's,
Can you give us some kind of idea of like the scope of this? So people coming to America on, let's say, an immigrant visa and having a child here that basically gives them kind of de facto citizenship or, like legal status because they have a child. What's the scope of that? How big is that?
well,
What's going on?
that's not what I was focused on with the article. I think it is true that there are pathways you can get citizenship based off close family members, but I don't think anyone's arguing that that's a constitutional question. So you could pass a law saying if you're the parent of a minor child, we're going to deport you. I mean, I guess I'm actually not sure. I think right now, there's not really any. I don't think there's any law saying we can't just deport. If you're here illegally, if you're not here legally and you have a child here, in theory, we could just send people back in that situation. I think we've been more reluctant when there's a family relationship. So my concern is more like Congress has the authority to put some restrictions up. What that looks like with regard to, whether or not we have to aggressively deport everyone who's here illegally is a separate question. No, I think we should. I think we should be pretty aggressive about enforcement just because the numbers are so great. In a different circumstance, I think we could be more generous. But that's a little bit different than the constitutional question. And if you have an immigrant visa, I would say I'm not arguing anything should change. The issue is right now, if you're on any sort of legal visa or you're here illegally, if you're on a tourist visa, you fly here, you're here for 2 weeks, or you're here 4 weeks. So you get here 4 weeks and you have a baby, and then you stay and leave for the minimum amount of time you can safely stay before leaving. That gets a citizen indefinitely. That's how the rules work right now. And I think that's really dysfunctional. Like if we want to say this person, we want this family to become American citizens, there should be a process. We should have some sort of agreed upon standard for that, and not just be who happens to be pregnant at the same time they have a temporary visa. That just seems inherently open to creating outcomes that we didn't vote for.
Yeah, that's all seems very logical to me. I think there's some kind of an emotional argument that there's something about being an American, that being born here makes you an American. That's part of your citizenship, and just kind of the two go hand in hand. How would you address that to people who think that taking away that birthright citizenship is just un-American? How would you address that?
I think it's really kind of a modern phenomenon that you have lots of people coming in airplanes from really far away. I think the idea that everyone within the territory of the United States is an American citizen, I don't think that's fundamental to being American. I think in the New World, people felt that their countries didn't have enough people, and the New World as a group, not just the United States, has had much more lax rules for becoming a citizen than the Old World. Now, I was in one of the more restrictive countries not that long ago, the United Arab Emirates, and there you can be there for your whole life and never become a citizen. And if you're not an Arab or from certain Arab countries, it's much harder to become a citizen. Generally speaking, they don't give citizenship to people who are in the country. It's just purely economic migration. So that is true. That's very different in the United States, but I think it's been more circumstantial factors that have led to the New World as a whole, not just the U.S. being much more open on immigration because the population was lower. And so I don't think that that's really a fundamental part of American citizenship. You could pass this law and still have pretty liberal immigration laws. It's a related issue. I mean, basically, most people that would like to change this do favor more restriction. That's just how it lines up right now. But logically, it's not really the same question. I mean, I could say, okay, I want Congress to be able to make the decision, and then say, yeah, we want lots of tech workers coming in from other countries. We want to just brain drain the world, but we don't want people to be able to scam the system by coming in on a tourist visa. Well, it's supposed to be a short trip, and then creating a permanent relationship with America by timing that with the birth of their child. So in theory, it's separate. It just happens that I think most people that share my concern over the permanent immigration from birthright citizenship also do have some broader concerns, but it wouldn't have to be that way. Like you could have a country which had very limited population and which wanted to grow their population through immigration, but also wanted to have some say, not allow people to create a fait accompli just by crossing the border and having. And there's also a security concern. Like if we have very lax rules for people people who are about to have kids or whatever, it encourages more people to do it, I think. Just like when we had more lax rules for unaccompanied minors, and that led to hundreds of thousands of unaccompanied minors at the border. So even though a lot of these cases are pretty sympathetic, if you create lax rules for very sympathetic cases, you get more of them because people will exploit that. So I think you kind of have to be a little bit tough-minded about this, or you're going to create more of the situations that you were trying to help people in the situations, but then if you help people in the situations in the wrong way, a whole lot of people will put themselves in the situation. So that's a broad.
So I want to get back to something. This is probably not exactly like what you're talking about, but you did mention this idea that some people, I think Vivek Ramaswamy has been one who's pushed this idea that we use our tech sector to brain drain the world, that we scalp the most talented, intelligent people from around the world and we bring them here and we make our country richer. And there's been kind of this divide in the American conservative movement between people who are almost like this kind of quasi-libertarian view of scalping the best talent from the world to a more, I don't know if you call it nativist view that wants to much more restrict immigration. So can you unpack that for us at all?
Right. Well, I think conservatives are very suspicious because they've just been burned on this issue very many times. Now, I do think Trump's staff is much more, he has a lot of people around him that are very sympathetic to this concern. So I don't think it's going to be a repeat. George W. Bush was already more liberal, or he was already less concerned about immigration's effects. I think it's actually interesting with George Bush. I think his willingness to invade other countries and his willingness to let lots of people come to the United States kind of went hand in hand, because he was just not, I don't think he or his father, but certainly I think neither of them had a particularly good grasp of other cultures. George W. Bush certainly did not. So just completely ignorant of his attempt to impose democracy on Iraq it wasn't going to work based off of the kinship structures of the society. They had an opportunity to bring the king of Afghanistan back. Like people who were okay with us, or at least were willing to tolerate us for a little while, were likely going to vote for that, and they scuttled that. So I think there was just a lack of understanding of the factors which make other cultures have different results when they try to do the same thing. So there's that background. I think the Bush administrations, both of them, and also the Reagan amnesty, have made conservatives kind of concerned about what Republican politicians may do. Even somebody like Reagan, who he's extremely popular, has been extremely popular for many years. And many conservatives feel that was probably one of his worst decisions, was creating an amnesty, which I think was 2.7 million people directly given amnesty, and then they're bringing in other people. I think it's probably, I would guess, probably over 10 million just based off of, if we include everyone associated with the people who got amnesty. It was a very large number, and then more people moved in because they thought they were going to get another amnesty, which is constantly being discussed. There's a concern about the effects of legal immigration. Now, there's maybe a little bit of a generational divide when we're talking about the Bushes, for example. So I think it was 1970, America had basically the lowest percentage of immigrants it ever had. And now it's either the highest or almost the highest. I think younger Americans are seeing a lot of cultural dislocation and have a lot of concern about this issue that maybe they may feel is ignored by people, certainly people in a higher socioeconomic bracket, maybe get to interact with very skilled, very elite immigrants and don't bear some of the costs of recklessly, letting people in who may not have a lot of sympathy for the culture of the country. And so, for example, with H-1Bs, Elon Musk at one point had an H-1B, so maybe that's why he was kind of riled up about this issue. And if you're in a lower end company or you're in a lower end position, I think the chances that you'd interact with somebody who maybe wasn't as elite but was still taking an American job are higher. I think I'm trying to remember we had I actually, as a lawyer, I've worked on a little bit of immigration stuff as part of a company, not as my main job, but in a company, I had tried to facilitate helping some, at least one employee out, or one or two or three employees out with immigration-related issues. But there's some companies where there's just large numbers of H-1B employees coming in. And then of course, there's people that are worried about, may have a reflexive worry about racism, or maybe they reflexively are concerned about immigration from certain areas. And I think that's something that conservatives in general just need to react to a little bit more calmly. I mean, you do have some people that are irrationally xenophobic, but I think that you can have a sense of self and sense of identity and a desire to not massively culturally change the country without being a Nazi. And I think that there's, among certain strains of conservatism, I don't think there was as much of an awareness of culture. And I think a lot of younger conservatives are aware that that's an issue. And with regard to H-1B specifically, if the median Indian immigrant had the same politics as Vivek Ramaswamy, I think people would be less worried about immigration from India. But the fact is that that's probably the skilled immigrant group that has political sympathies on average, which are just the most out of line with not just the Republican Party, but I think where America's been historically. Like you can look at free speech or any number of issues. It has the potential to really politically shift elite spaces in the country. Just because somebody is very skilled and is very smart doesn't mean that they're, going to support, gun rights or free speech or any number of things that Americans have traditionally been outside of what some countries consider normal on. So I think that's a legitimate concern, and some people just don't think about that. I think, is somebody contributing to the tax base? Is somebody a hardworking person who loves their kids and that sort of thing? Which that's all good. I mean, I'm not against those things. I have friends from basically every single country. That's a slight exaggeration, but you can find things to like in every single country, but that doesn't mean it scales up well when you're importing millions of people. And we've seen that in Canada. A lot of American conservatives are looking at Canada or Australia and seeing some of the problems there as a sort of a mirror image of things that are going on in the U.S., but more extreme. And you don't really want to imitate the immigration systems of Canada or Australia, even though those have been more selective. And I think some of these things can be bridged. I think we could probably have faster immigration for some of the most elite people. Like if the numbers were capped, if you had competitive slots, there's any number of ways. I mean, this is procedural stuff. It's not constitutional stuff. So there's probably more than one compromise which can make these different sub-factions of people that have supported President Trump happy, or at least, they give each side something they can live with. Because I think, the immigration system, it is a mess. I already knew it's a mess. My wife's actually from a foreign country, so I have direct experience of how slow some of these processes can be. So it's not that the people's claims about the immigration system being a mess are untrue. I just think sometimes that's not balanced against, okay, what are the downsides if we get rid of every single obstacle, or we do that without putting some boundaries on that. Right now, I think sometimes we'll have tried to limit immigration. Maybe, I don't know. This is a theory that some of the immigration has been limited by slow walking or not having fast processes. And I think the compromise, which might make conservatives who have concerns about this, is what I mentioned, just making it faster but capping economic migration somehow. So that's a thought. I don't know if that's what will happen or not.
That certainly sounds like a reasonable compromise that at least some people could get behind. Coming back to this schism, the divide within the conservative movement between, you talked about both Bushes and Reagan. You hear about the neocons, people who had this hawkish foreign policy and kind of a quasi-libertarian economic policy at home. And now there's this kind of newer brand of MAGA conservatism. And your middle name is Burke, after the father of conservatism, Edmund Burke. And I'm wondering, how does your philosophy, as it pertains to conservatism, how does it guide you through this debate and this back and forth that we're seeing in the conservative movement?
Yeah. So my middle name was partially after Edmund Burke. It was a family name, but it was also partially after Edmund Burke. So yeah, that I've read one of his books, which it talks about the reflections on the revolution in France, and it talks about the dangers of certain types of radical revolutionary change. It also talks about one reason that the British monarchy was not tyrannical was that it was more secure, and that's something which developed. He doesn't discuss it in that book, but it's something that I can recall, but it's been a while since I've read it. But it's something that developed over a long period of time. A lot of the cultural institutions that have made Anglo countries places that lots of different people from lots of different cultures want to move to took a lot of time to develop. And it does give me a bit of caution when, and especially in the U.S., when you have immigration automatically linked to citizenship. It might be different if those were a bit more separated. Given that, that was one thing with George Bush. He just seemed to take the American norm as the norm for the rest of the world, and it's really not. There's a lot of things that we take for granted that other people may like. It doesn't mean like they can't look at that and say, oh yeah, so there's some good things about that, but they may not have the cultural infrastructure to perpetuate. One big thing that there's been a lot of research on is, say, kinship marriage, right? So in all of Western Europe, that was really cracked down on. Through the influence of the church, and there were a lot of laws against marrying your cousin, right? So when you look at countries that have lots of kinship marriage, the people may have many admirable traits, but the way the social infrastructure and the cultural capital is set up, they're not going to be very friendly to democracy. Like, you can't easily impose a democracy on a society with lots of kinship marriage because the loyalty just doesn't run is in the diffuse way. I think monarchy is a much easier and more sustainable way of having some sort of social order, at least which family is in charge, because otherwise you end up with just people constantly trying to put their relatives on top. And so that's it actually ends up maybe being a more transparent system to just have a king in a country which has a whole lot of kinship marriage. So there's deeply embedded cultural things which have made Anglo countries distinctive and have very broad institutions. And if you're not careful, if you have immigration policy which doesn't have an eye towards what's the carrying capacity for assimilation, right? Then you may erode those things, because it's not like we can't have immigrants from Syria who become happy Americans who are our neighbors and we get along with. But the issue is, if you do like Germany has done, and they're letting in over 1 million people, they're going to swamp your cultural system, and you're not maybe going to be as alert to who's a problem within that culture as somebody from that culture would be, right? It's not just letting in terrorists, but just letting people that are not very friendly to, are not willing to adapt to your way of life. And an awareness that many of the things we like they're not necessarily particular to us in the sense that no one else can enjoy them, but particular to conditions which have taken a lot of effort to build up. We want to be careful about just creating a situation where we're relying on people just adopting that right away without an acclimation period. Like, if we're creating majorities of immigrants, which in my own state, that's been the hope of the Democrats, is that the politics will be swamped through immigration. That didn't work out that way for them that last election, but it hasn't. It has. And people talk about past waves of immigration, like, oh, they said the same things about the past waves. Well, actually, if you look at it, some of the past, it's like you go back 100 years, there are places which have been very, very changed. Not always positively, by mass immigration. So look up the Curley effect of the Irish mayor in Boston, where he was deliberately trying to run the Anglos out of Boston because his constituency was Irish, and deliberately governing, or at least he was incentivized to govern the city in a worse way because that was, his constituents were poor Irish people, and running off wealthier Anglos was to his political advantage. I think people are very naive, I guess, because for the sake of social peace, there's this kind of myth that past immigration, it all worked out smoothly. In some cases, there are parts of the country which are much more culturally alien from each other than they would be if we hadn't had some of these previous waves of immigration, which doesn't mean the country hasn't benefited in some ways from that. Obviously, there have been brilliant people who've immigrated. There have been immigrant groups that have maybe helped to rebalance at least their part of the country in ways which were to some extent good. But yeah, I just wouldn't take that for granted the way that George Bush, I think, did, and maybe to some extent Ronald Reagan did.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. So I've heard a number of thinkers wrestle with this concept of the limits of liberalism. By which I mean classical liberalism, like what Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance. This idea that we have a free, open, tolerant society like we have in America, and one of the limitations or liabilities or a vulnerability is that when you have that free, open, tolerant society, you can let in people who don't respect freedom, right? And so how do you kind of deal with that dichotomy of you want a free society, but you also want to protect that free society? How do you wrestle with that?
Right. Well, I think it depends on if you're looking at if this is, I'm the one, writing the constitutional amendment, or if I'm just working within the constraints of our likely winners of contemporary American politics. The ideal answer was if I was just like, somebody saying, hey, Ian, write our constitution for us. I mean, I would probably have like a book list, or I would literally probably just have a multiple choice test, like a really hard, like set of multiple choice tests on culturally significant books. And then if you can't pass them, you can't vote. I mean, that's obviously politically not tenable in America right now. So, I mean, but if you're just saying like what would work well and what would make the society resilient, I mean, I can think of some reforms which would. In the current political situation, I would just be very cautious about immigration. Now, I'm not. My politics haven't really changed by virtue of marrying somebody from outside the country, but obviously, I think people can become American. People can move into the country and benefit it. But I think the fact that can happen doesn't mean that it's wise right now. I think we've just let in too many people. We've naturalized too many people. And I think we should just be very restrictive, not because that's the way things have to be all the time, but I just think our system's very fragile right now. I think we probably should have some sort of 1920s style immigration moratorium where we really, really lower the numbers drastically, just because I think the way the U.S. system is set up right now, not even, I'm not saying this is how it has to be for all time, but just right now, I think things are very fragile. I think once you get, I think somebody said like 15% foreign born, you do start to get a lot of social problems. And I don't know if that's the right number, but I certainly think there's a carrying capacity issue. I mean, some immigrant groups would be pretty easy to assimilate. I think people from Latin America, I think the culture in many ways is not, it's certainly not the most incompatible with American culture, but the issue is just the numbers are so high. You have enclaves where people know nothing about American culture. People just talk to other people from that culture, and that sets you up for conflict where groups are fighting each other that are at least politically or in conflict with each other that don't know anything about each other. And so I think the way to deal with that is just, you got to slash the numbers. And that's separate from what my article's about. My article's, encouraging Congress to assert its authority to where then we can make a decision about where we want immigrants from, or how many we want. But even easy to assimilate groups when you're getting into the tens of millions, I mean, they're likely to just replicate their culture here. And there's a good book on that. It's pretty short. It's titled The Culture Transplant. That's one that's maybe worth reading for somebody. If somebody wants to read about this, doesn't want to spend a lot of time on it. It gets a lot of it has links to other articles and whatnot, which discusses people really do. I mean, people don't just flip their cultures when they move to a new country necessarily. It may last for several generations. You see ongoing effects, and you can see that not just in America, but in other countries. And another one, if somebody has a bit more time, The Weirdest People in the World is a great book. It discusses a lot of the distinctive things about Western psychology. Some of them I think are hackable. I don't think all of these things are necessarily good. We may have too much of some of these things now, or at least be in kind of a failure mode for some of these things. But I think it's important to understand why some of these things are long-term and aren't necessarily going to change right away. It's not, I think all these problems are fixable. I mean, there are some issues where at this point our options are kind of constrained. I think we're just going to have a lot of immigrants that aren't completely assimilated for a little while. And the best way to do that, the best way to deal with that is not keep having people coming in because they're more likely to assimilate. If they're not, there's more limits on interaction with the old country. They're more likely to assimilate into an American culture. And that's a little bit harder than people think a lot of the times, because when they think of American culture, people will sometimes think of, we all watch the same movies. Well, that's not deep American culture. The fact that you can make the same pop culture references doesn't mean you really have a shared frame of reference that's actually capable of solving social problems together at any deep level. There was a guy I read, he's a blogger. I'm not that familiar with him, but there's one of the guys I cite in the footnotes talks about working with Somalis who moved to the U.S. and he'd had very good interactions with them as I think he was in the military or something. But he said many of them would become kind of American, but not, the example he uses, Minnesotan. And so they would assimilate into American culture at the level of pop references, but they are not deeply woven into the community, and their deep identity is in this old country identity. And you can see it gets kind of crazy where you have, I don't think he mentions this, but you have different groups of Somalians who are loyal to different sub-factions within the country. Like Ilhan Omar was in English, she advocates for left liberalism, but in her language, she was advocating for irredentism and expansionism and taking things back that used to belong to Somalia.
Wow.
And there's Somalians that are aligned with the portion of the country that we're probably about to recognize as independent Somaliland, all in the same states. So it's, that's an example of something which is potentially culturally fragmenting. Like you've seen, we've seen other countries where, like in the UK, where you have Hindu and Muslim mobs fighting each other, or Hindu and Sikh. I think in Canada it was Hindu versus Sikh groups that were fighting each other in the streets, and that's just not. Some of those people may be very productive members of the community, but I don't think it's the country as a whole is not coming out as a winner when you're importing those sort of conflicts, particularly from groups that are already very culturally distant. So it's not like these were conflicts that were going to influence us anyway. Like if a bunch of Scottish people and English people, back in the day had gotten angry at each other, that was a conflict which was maybe, if you were a colonist of Britain, you're maybe just going to be influenced by those conflicts anyway. But a lot of these conflicts are really kind of not, it was a line, not my circus, not my monkeys, just not things which are going to be naturally impacting the U.S. and which American police are probably not going to have the skills to navigate wisely, or at least that's going to take up a lot of bandwidth if we're having to train people in all of these initially distant to us cultural disputes.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I had a friend who was from grad school who's Egyptian, and was telling me, he's like, some people are just not ready for democracy. And you talk about like this, not sharing a fundamental culture. It's more than just, did you listen to the latest Taylor Swift song? It's a bit like, what does democracy mean to you? And in Egypt, after the Arab Spring, it's like, hey, they won their democracy, and the first thing they did was vote for the Muslim Brotherhood. And in Gaza, the Palestinians, a majority of them elected Hamas.
Right. Well, there was a saying that in Africa, there was a problem in the post-colonial era of, was it one vote once or something like that, where, you'd have one vote and then would put in a dictatorship. And so, just because there's deep cultural divides doesn't mean countries can't move in our direction, or that immigrant groups can't move in our direction. I'm just very concerned about the carrying capacity. And it creates, I think, just really perverse. You've talked about, I haven't followed your recent work closely, but you've talked about some of the stuff going on in like psychotherapy. It just creates very perverse incentives where you can have, like in California, where you've got the sort of the woke elites at the top of the state, and then you've got a lot of recent immigrants to the state who maybe probably at home don't really like all of these things, but there's an incentive for groups to work together for policy outcomes that nobody wants, or at least a lot of people don't want. And I think it would be maybe a little bit harder in a more cohesive community. I'm not saying I'm not saying there aren't cases where people in areas where there's been more cultural homogeneity that they haven't had these problems, but I do think it creates an issue where you've got client groups that are not really that familiar with democracy as it's practiced in the United States, going to the Democratic Party for reasons that are particular to them, whether it's they want, whether it's a welfare thing, or whether it's wanting more immigration, wanting legalization for relatives. They end up supporting politicians with crazy gender identity policies that they probably don't want in their own home. And so I think it creates an opportunity for bad things to get into power just because you have a large number of voters that their eye is on something else other than the well-being of the United States. It's on, I got to legalize my cousin or something like that, which isn't, I understand why you would want that. But if you have a large enough group of people that are animated by getting their cousin legal status that may result in some really bad outcomes that most people would recognize as really bad, even people from that community. And that's another area where, when we talk about immigration, it could be a benefit to both sides. You can have people, and maybe their skills are being neglected in their home country, and they move to the United States, and all of a sudden, they're a billionaire, or at least they're more affluent because they have the ability to do something that just because of the economies of scale or something, it can be done better in the United States, or will be protected legally in the United States. Okay, it can help both sides, but sometimes it is kind of a lose-lose if you have somebody moving to the U.S. to work at a job because of these loose immigration policies, we're not outsourcing it, right? Like say that maybe that factory would have been built in Latin America, right? And maybe the person could be working there next to their family. So if somebody's illegally immigrating in the U.S. because we're letting that happen, well, okay, now they don't have a base of cousins supporting them. Their abuela is now back home, potentially. You've got potentially hundreds of years of family history in an area that they're now dislocated from. And then they're buying a house and then potentially making it harder for some American who has hundreds of years of history here to be well-rooted in their own community. So it's not necessarily always good for the people that are coming up here, that they're all of a sudden in a very dislocated sort of environment. And I think you do see increased rates of, I forget which mental illnesses, like schizophrenia. There's some mental illnesses that in minority or immigrant communities you get more than if somebody were just in their home country. And probably, I think dislocation is one factor in that. And I'm not saying the government can really solve that problem, because if we have a skilled immigrant, maybe they'll have some of the same personal issues, but it's not necessarily like you're oppressing somebody. You say, no, we're going to build that factory in your home country rather than build it here and then staff it with people from your home country. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. We could, when we're filling factories in the United States with foreign workers, okay, that makes the U.S.'s GDP higher. I don't know if it makes anyone better off. I mean, they could be, where they have, these centuries of family memory and have a sense of rootedness, and we could be building over there. I feel like it's okay if the U.S. GDP is a little lower in order to have not as much dislocation from immigration.
That's interesting. You mentioned that trade-off, and it is a trade-off. Thomas Sowell always talks about there's no right or wrong necessarily. It's a value judgment based on what trade-off you're willing to accept, essentially. So I think that's interesting. You phrase it that way. I want to shift gears a little bit, talking about my book, The Woke Mind. I had a short chapter on how wokeness is infiltrating the legal profession. Critical race theory started in law schools, and I'm wondering what you're seeing as a lawyer about the social justice movement having an influence on your field.
I think I've missed some of it because of where I was in law school. You do see, like, there's a DEI officer that was hired at my law school, so I definitely see it. Of course, maybe honestly, I mean, maybe some of it I don't see directly because I'm disfavored in the hiring practice because I'm a white male. Maybe I am impacted by some of it. I do see it is true. Like if a minority performs well at something and a white guy performs well at something, people will get really, really excited. But I don't know if that's really wokeness. I think that sort of reaction predates wokeness. I mean, there is definitely, I don't know if it's favoritism. I mean, it just may, people from a particular area or social group may be just excited to see somebody doing something different, that's not necessarily bad. But, I'm not sure how much of it I have seen directly. I feel like when I was in law school, it just wasn't a place where that was as much in vogue. I think there were other law schools where that would be. I was in law school. Let's see, I got my JD 2010 to 2013, and then I finished getting my LLM at the end of 2015. So there are definitely places where I think it may have been more that way. You could see things which were inherently amenable to it. I mean, like, I don't know that we would agree on this particular topic, but there's like a gay and lesbian law students association. I mean, you could see things which were culturally compatible with this more aggressive woke worldview. But I wasn't at a law school where that was. I mean, it wasn't like people were disrupting Federalist Society meetings. I was the vice president of the Federalist Society when I was. It's probably my second year as a law. When I was a 2L. When I was a 2L, I was the vice president of the Federalist Society. It's not like people were coming disrupting our meetings or something like that. But then again, I was in Mississippi, where the school is fairly liberal. I mean, it's not like there's a bunch of. I mean, by my standards, it's not like there were a bunch of super conservative faculty, but there were some conservative, and still are some conservative law faculty there. So, yeah, so I could definitely. Maybe in terms of some of the speakers people were platforming, there are certainly speakers who I'm sure became very woke when they had the opportunity. I did have some friends from law school that kind of digitally cut interactions with me because I was against DEI, but it wasn't. I mean, it's not like we were interacting professionally at that point. So I did have somebody who got angry at me because I was criticizing DEI, and I think that was before it became evident that the anti-DEI people were going to win in many places. So yeah, around the edges, I've seen it. And I think it's very strong some places, just not some places that the places it's strongest, or maybe not the places where I am. And that may be a correlation, maybe an unchosen aspect.
Yeah. What's your argument against DEI?
Well, I mean, I think there's more than one issue there. It does tie into immigration because it's interesting that a lot of protections that were implemented to help African Americans get applied to anyone who's not white. So that's ends up being, it just seems, it doesn't seem how there's any real justice reason to favor the child of Brahmin immigrants over a white guy in America. I mean, it's like, oh, okay, all of a sudden you're, somebody may claim to be an oppressed category, and then back in the home country, and nobody would think of them that way. So it does seem a little unfair if somebody can flee India because they have discrimination against Brahmins because they have their own kind of DEI thing. I don't know much about it. It's like if you're in an upper caste, I think there's some discrimination or policies which inherently discriminate against members of the more elite castes in India. And then they come here, and then in some context, they could be beneficiaries of DEI, which just seems like a ridiculous result. So that's one result. I think just a colorblind approach to most jobs is going to result in more harmony between ethnic groups, because you're going to have, in a country like America, you're going to have a spread of people from a wide variety of groups who excel. And I think it's very difficult to blame the particulars of U.S. history for differences in outcome, honestly. I think that you look at different countries, and I think the same cultural groups have very similar, there's very similar differences in performance between cultural groups, regardless of whether the country has the history of slavery or specific discriminatory laws that the U.S. has had. Now, I think, you go to the past, obviously there's extremely unjust laws against African Americans. The most heinous is like laws against educating when slavery was in effect. It wasn't just slavery. There are also discriminatory laws against educating slaves or against educating African Americans. So the history is, contains many wrong things, but I don't think DEI is really going to fix the problem, because what you end up is, if you are somebody like, say, Thomas Sowell, who's, I think Thomas Sowell is probably is certainly in the highest level of competency of American academics just on his own merits. I read one of his books not knowing he was African American, and it was very good. So, I was impressed by him, without knowing anything about his ethnicity. And so if you're somebody like Thomas Sowell, DEI does kind of tend to make people more suspicious of your accomplishments. So if you are an African American that can perform in elite spaces just as good as a white person, there'll always be the suspicion that you were let in for DEI or affirmative action reasons. And so I think it's just better to have everyone be trusted. I think there are some exceptions. I will say, like, if there was a police office which was interacting with one cultural group a lot, in different parts of the country, maybe in some places that would be like Navajo or some less common cultural group. But I think it's okay to put people from those groups and positions just to allow for smoother interactions with those communities. But there may be trade-offs. Like, if you lower the standards to have a lot of African-American police officers in an area with lots of African-Americans, that might lead to different results than people expect. It might lead to more people getting shot, right? If you have a bunch of unqualified officers, I don't think that the disparities are primarily driven by racism. I think if you put more untrained people in those positions, I think that the communities you're trying to help may suffer. But so there may be a trade-off there, just in terms of having some people that look like the people who are in the community may lead to more trust. It may lead to more people being willing to go to the police and tell them before problems get out of hand. I don't know. I feel like it's something you could probably study empirically to some degree. So not every single outreach, if we have somebody who is able to communicate with a particular group, that's a positive. And if on pure merit grounds they would lose, I don't think that's always bad. If you're putting somebody who's better able to interact with a particular community. But in most contexts, like corporations and things like that, I think you're just creating a situation where people are going to be resentful. They're going to be around less competent people from a particular ethnicity, and there's going to be more conflict than if you just kind of let the chips fall where they may, and except that sometimes the outcomes are going to be disparate even when you're as fair as you possibly can be.
Yeah, going back to something you said a second ago, I think one of the more nefarious aspects of racial preferences and DEI is that it can make racism rational. Because if you had a colorblind meritocracy, it would be completely irrational to question the accomplishments or credentials of a racial minority. That would be an irrational thing to do. But if you have certain racial preferences where certain people are elevated based on race and other people are downgraded based on race, then making those judgments suddenly becomes rational.
Well, so to give you a concrete example, you probably already know of this, but if you can see the criminal records of people applying, people don't discriminate against African Americans as much. So, for example, there's a lot more violent crime in the U.S. that's committed by African Americans. but it doesn't make discrimination lower if you know which specific people did the crime, right? People will discriminate less if they have more individual information and not make assumptions based off the base group rate. So providing negative information, which may result in more candidates being eliminated from a specific group, may then help the candidates that that doesn't apply to. One form of discrimination, which is good and legal, which can avoid these issues, is you can discriminate in favor of servicemen. So if somebody's been in the military. So I was involved in hiring decisions, and I intentionally sought out people that had military backgrounds, because you're automatically, there's certain things that you can't have done, or at least you didn't get
You're
caught.
selecting for discipline, and
Right. So
you're weeding out people who don't have the discipline to go through that. Yeah.
Right. So that was when I was involved in hiring decisions at a previous employer. I would try and get veterans, particularly for jobs which didn't require a college degree. Not because obviously there are veterans that have a college degree, but they would maybe tend to be more specialized. So if I was a warehouse job and I could find somebody that had been in the military, discharged honorably, that was good. So anyway, just for providing more individual information about a person and allowing people to make judgments based off that individual information can result in less discrimination. That's just based off of a generalized perception that people from a certain race or have more associations with some sort of legal problem or something like that.
Interesting. So we're getting close to the end of time. I have two questions left for you. One is, you're also an expert on space law. So could you tell us just a little bit, just a hint at what your expertise on space law is about?
Yeah, so that's I've had a couple paid assignments on that, but it was predominantly an academic specialty. So a lot of it was just digging into international treaties and international court of justice cases, which I think in general conservatives have a reputation for not being interested in that, but I found it pretty fascinating just looking at how countries had decided disputes, and there's a lot of historical information in that, which I was a history major undergrad, so it was interesting to me. But there's 5 and really 4 treaties which govern space. There's another one which hasn't really been ratified. So you've got several different treaties that govern activities in outer space. That kind of forms the written side of what you're doing, and just kind of there, easy to find. You've got the Outer Space Treaty. You've got the Rescue and Return Agreement. There's the Liability Convention, and with these different agreements, you can look at, okay, here's what the law is, and then there's a lot of just general international law which comes into that as far as how you interpret it. One thing I could go on for quite a bit about that's been in the news somewhat recently is using resources in outer space, and I'm just very excited about the potential. In which I've argued elsewhere that's legal as long as your particular government wants to allow you to use the resources. But there's a big dispute about what it means that states are not allowed to appropriate celestial bodies. So that has led to some people to come to the conclusion that you can't mine or can't do things like that, which is wrong. I could go on for a long time about why that's wrong, but that's one area where international law can affect national legislation, and then there's a lot of the national legislation in the U.S. enables the FAA to be the regulator. So it's the FAA, not NASA, that's regulating stuff in space. And some of this may change pretty quickly. We'll see what the coming administration does. But we're going to see some pretty impressive technological changes. We've got the so-called the Starship rocket is actually going to be able to get people to Mars. And I think a lot of people don't understand what a big change it is to be able to land the rockets, because that's most of your cost goes because the rockets were destroyed. With the Falcon 9, you already had a huge technological change that was already had us in position for things to really be revolutionized as far as what it was achievable in space for at least for a price that most people were willing to, that actual not private or state actors were willing to spend. And then the Starship's designed to carry 100 people into space at a time. So that's really a big deal. And you can construct things because of its size. It's going to be easier to construct things. You could launch things in one piece that previously you had to build, or you could construct things using fewer pieces. So this all may result in changes in the law. We'll see. I think the technology is probably going to go a lot faster than the law will, just because people that would like to see changes in the law are afraid that they're not going to get enough stakeholders on board to say come up with a new treaty. So I think it's quite possible that things could stay pretty much the same legally, even when we're as the ships are on the way to Mars, because that could come in. You could send a robotic ship 2 years. You could have people going in 4 years or not. If it's delayed, it's likely not to be delayed that long. Very exciting. In Texas is likely to be a big player in that just for geographical reasons. There's already a lot of investment in the state, but also the closer to the equator you are, you get a boost. You get more of a boost for particular launch paths, so you can save fuel. And I mean, it's a big deal if you're launching rocket after rocket that you're getting just a little bit of extra speed just from where you are geographically. And so South Texas and South Florida are just natural launch points as far as the U.S. is concerned. So very excited about it.
It's very exciting indeed, and that's interesting stuff. I actually have two more questions for you. One, you can answer as much or as little as you like on this one, but it is there's a couple recent or somewhat recent Supreme Court cases. One was abortion and overturning Roe versus Wade, and the other one was dealt with child transitions for gender transitions. I'm wondering if you had any kind of just unique perspective from the legal angle as a lawyer on either of those cases.
I don't think my perspective is particularly unique. I mean, I think you'd get kind of a similar take from any conservative lawyer. I mean, I'm opposed to gender transitions, child or adult, and I think, and I'm very opposed to abortion. Think under the default, one thing that a lot of people may not know if you're not coming from a historical or legal perspective is the default in the U.S. system is that criminal law is state law. It's actually the 14th Amendment or interpretations of the 14th Amendment that led to certain things being federalized that were completely under the control of the states. So in saying that, that's, if you meet a conservative lawyer and they want to they care about the issue, they would tell you the same thing that I'm saying right now. So by handing it back to the states, that's on the abortion side, that's really just what the default had always been prior to Roe versus Wade. One thing that people should consider when they're hearing, there have been some horror stories about things that happened in Texas and whatnot. The law does, the Texas law does, I mean, there is a life of the mother exception. They're not, there is an exception for if the baby's in the wrong place, you could still remove the baby. I mean, there's lots of things which people have been scared with saying, oh yeah, you're going to be criminalized if you have an ectopic pregnancy. And that's just not really the case. I think some of the lawyers for the other side have maybe scared doctors into making bad decisions in terms of applying the law. And maybe, there have been cases where people maybe didn't get a medical intervention that they needed because the doctors were scared because they'd gotten bad legal advice. So that would be a caution I would add, because I would assume your audience includes plenty of people who have a different or on a different side of this issue than I am. But I think a lot of those horror stories are not really what the law is mandating. And I think that by saying this is what the law says, I mean, if you're really concerned about the safety of women who are in those particular situations, it would be better to clarify that that's not actually what the law says. And I think, I think there have been some bad decisions. And of course, there have been things which have been misreported. Like people said, oh, this person was charged for this, when actually you read the full facts and there are a whole bunch of other things. Somebody had intentionally, for no health reason, killed a baby or something like that. It was reported as if they were being criminalized for because of a medical emergency. Yeah, I like I said, none of that's particularly unique, other than highlighting, that the default in our system is not that the federal government regulates these things. I'm open to it, honestly, just because there's already been a lot of other things under the 14th Amendment that I think there's less reason to say the federal government has authority over. It says that a citizen shall not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Well, I think there's an argument that that an unborn child is being deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law by abortion. Now, I think an originalist might disagree with that for various reasons, but I think it's closer to the original intent than many things that have been let in under the 14th Amendment. As far as gender transitions, I mean, I think that is, by default, that's a state law issue. I mean, I would be quite happy if the Trump administration allows lawsuits over the issue interstate. And I think that there's a big problem with California and several other states disfavoring people in custody disputes, where you're having people basically kidnapping their kids and going to another state to transition the child and have medical interventions that can't be reversed done in another state. I mean, that's not a huge number of cases yet, but it has happened, and I think that the federal government has a role in stopping that. And I think one thing I probably am in the minority on, or at least not in political power on the Republican side, is I do have a lot of concerns about IVF, because a lot of Republicans are like, this won't impact IVF. But I mean, like I think it's a legitimate concern of the state to stop people from creating a bunch of embryos that are not going to be brought into the world outside of a test tube. I mean, I think that's actually pretty egregious, and it's really really sad where we are as a country that's apparently a controversial position. It's in many Republican circles that creating embryos in a lab with no intention of letting them live a life, that just seems like even some liberals would say that's not a good use of science. At least back in the, I feel like there's got to be some bleeding heart liberal somewhere that thinks that's not a good use of the lab. My view is that it's constitutional for states to limit that. I think that's pretty straightforward, but I don't know how much political right now. It seems to be not a very politically popular position for some reason.
Yeah, on both the abortion issue and the gender transition issue, there's been so much fear-mongering around that. In my grad program for counseling, professors consistently make it sound like if you advise a woman who's talking about getting an abortion, she later goes on and gets an abortion, or if you're advising a teenager who wants to get a medical transition, they go do it. If you are part of that therapy, you lose your license for life. And that's just not what the law says. They're just making this stuff up, So the fear-mongering is off the charts on a lot of these things.
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump's positions are much more moderate than mine on some of these issues. So the Texas law is probably more moderate than I am on some of these issues.
Okay. Yeah, my final question for you, Ian, and you can answer this from a legal perspective, from a cultural, political, whatever perspective you want to come from. What is an issue that we're not talking about that we should be talking about?
I think as far as culturally significant issues, I feel like surrogacy is one that is not on the radar. A lot of people that it seems like they should care. I mean, I think it's a big problem. I mean, maybe not in Ukraine now, but you had a lot of people, at least before the war, that were in contracts with women in Ukraine and a few other countries to have children for them. And I think that separating the birth of children from the physical relationship of the parents and making a commercial transaction out of it, I think that's, if that were done at scale, if that were actually done at scale, that would have a lot of negative social, it would create a lot of social pathologies. Right now, it's not being done at a large enough scale where that's obvious. I think that would become obvious. And I think that's something where it would be better if we did not learn that from experience. If we just, maybe it would be more politically tenable if we said, okay, it's legal. I think Denmark did this. Where he said it's legal, but you can't have a commercial contract about it. So if somebody's cousin or something wants to have their baby because their cousin can't have a baby, I don't think that's a good idea, honestly, but that might be more politically tenable, because if you just said this isn't something we're commercializing, then people would have the free choice if they can talk somebody into doing it for non-commercial reasons. But yeah, I think that's I think in general, the way people bond with parents is something that's not. It's only talked about to vilify parents. It's not talked about to build good, positive social policy that encourages healthy family relationships. There's other things related to that, like hopefully we will talk about how maybe some of our welfare programs right now are incentivizing lower class people to not get married because there's certain financial incentives they can get access to. And there's a host of things related to that that either elite people support, like because they're having kids real late, and then surrogacy is something they turn to have kids without impacting their careers or because they're past a certain age, or elite people don't even think about. We're incentivizing people to live in situations where the things are just vague and the kids are being brought up where their parents aren't married. Yeah, I think there's a lot of things like that people have discussed but are not being discussed in the legislature. A lot of it related to, I think a lot of it related to policy.
Ian, you just connected surrogacy to welfare dependency, and that's not a connection I would have ever made, but that's why I asked you to come on and talk, because you're an incredibly intelligent guy, a creative thinker, and a really interesting, unique thinker, and I really appreciate that.
Thank you for having me on. If you want to discuss space law for an hour, we can do that sometime in the future.
I'd love to. Hopefully we can have that conversation again sometime.
Okay, thank you.
All right, take care, Ian.